So, Grace, I've now known you, I think, 3 years, and as Wills Bonner's brand has evolved and developed, collaborating and working with other individuals, practitioners in the visual arts, but also beyond, filmmakers, musicians, literary theorists, has always been very important to you. And in fact, in the text that accompanied the editorial or the portfolio of images that you all worked on together, you said, and I quote, "I've always thought of Wills Bonner as a broader thing than a singular perspective. So I think it helps to be engaged in dialogue and collaboration with people that I admire and that can broaden the perspective of what it is. It's just not about me. I've always thought about a multiplicity of voices and perspectives. So it's more like a chorus of people I connect with. I don't create in isolation. It comes through collaboration and exchange." So your work with Nick carries that spirit forward, and I wanted to ask you, what about his practice interested you, and how did you come to be aware of Nick's work?
I became aware of Nick's work through seeing his book. I can't remember where I first saw it, but I was just blown away by the photographs and the immediacy of the work, and the fact that he'd kind of created this body of work over 10 years. Is that right? 10 years?
Yeah. Well, the mic sounds cool.
But there was a real immediacy about how you were connecting to different temporalities and reflecting the current moment, but also your engagement with India over that time. So I found that really interesting and direct, and I found his approach also quite challenging in a way to me, because I am quite specific and I like to have very specific frameworks, which is one of the reasons I started doing menswear, is being attracted to tailoring and having restrictions, and menswear as a format is something that has rules that have to be followed, and within that I kind of disrupt those things. But Nick's approach is very different from my own, and I think often with collaborating with artists, it's about opening up to a new way of working and a new way of seeing something. So I think that Nick's approach kind of challenged me in some ways, and I'm always interested in collaboration as a way to push me out of my comfort zone. So.
And the basis for your most recent collaboration, because Nick was mentioning that you'll have worked together 3 times, and the most recent, the basis of which, I mean, is the installation here, but the suite of images that were published in Another Man magazine is your Spring/Summer 19 collection, Ecstatic Recycle. Mm-hmm. And Nick mentioned that both of you were very aware of, doing this project in India, and how to represent another culture. And I'd love to hear you both talk a little bit more about, engaging with India as such. And previously with your collection Malik, you cited Malik Amber as your kind of conduit to your entry into your connection to India. And with this collection, you've mentioned Alice Coltrane and Terry Atkins, and how other people perceive the country as a way of kind of coming to it and to try to appreciate it.
Yeah, I think my connection to exploring a place is always coming from a black cultural perspective. So it's through that lens that I'm entering and imagining a space and an environment. So for me, Ecstatic Recital was about exploring devotional aesthetics. The work of Terry Adkins has been incredibly inspiring to myself, and just to understand how you can kind of communicate sound visually was something that I found really interesting. So I was finding a route to India through a series of different characters, kind of travellers, and Alice Coltrane's devotional and ecstatic music was also an entry point for me. So I think it was actually about sound in a way that was drawing me to somewhere, and also the idea of the formality within that. So ideas of repetition or mantra, specific vibrations and frequencies that was drawing me to explore a place. I saw an exhibition at the British Museum as well, which was about religion and the different elements that people use to kind of connect to spirituality. So whether that's fragrance and incense or bells or drums, thinking about the different instruments and apparatus that allows one to access a different state of consciousness. So for me, it was kind of about sound, but also exploring this idea of a black traveller in India, because that's not really an image that you see owned by kind of the black experience. Yeah. So for me, it was actually about positioning this idea of a black traveller, exploring and understanding a place in that way, but also meeting with other people that have been there, you know, so connecting to different histories and times. And this collection was actually then became about a group of travellers, and it was very global, but it was very much about how a traveller interprets a place. So in the collection, it incorporates technical clothing, kind of performance outerwear, mixed with brocade, like hand silk brocades that were created with raw mango, which is Indian textile manufacturer that you're aware of. So it was about kind of creating this hybrid intersection between these two elements of the wardrobe, really.
And Nick, can you talk about your relationship with India a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, mine is, I mean, that was a lot, and it's very complicated, as India is. But I think the first thing that always struck me is how warm and welcoming people are there. And I think this is something that subconsciously I was experiencing, but didn't really realize until recently, that a visitor or a guest is seen as an incarnation of God, and is to be treated as such. So I think that speaks so much about how in a country like that, especially that's so diverse, like people travel from within the country and from outside of the country, and are just they're always welcome everywhere. And I think that kind of sparked the ability to be able to move around and be invited into places and make work with and about people and their experiences with me and my experiences with them. And that's kind of what I feel like in a place like India has such a personal, everyone has such a personal viewpoint on their experience there. I decided to start focusing on that and like my personal relationship with it, of, you know, having gone there since I was very young, but growing up always in the U.S., seeing a ton of things I like thought were interesting but didn't really understand, and just seeing where that exploration started taking me. And then, funny enough, in the first collaboration that we did, I ended up by accident in a area that was, I like went to this town called Pushkar for a festival, and I ended up getting a job right before that kind of pushed my time there towards the end of the festival. So I ended up seeing more of people leaving the festival than the actual, like, you know, why people were there. And in seeing that, there were so many communities of people that were transient and kind of go from one to the next of these religious or devotional either festivals or gatherings throughout the country. And so we ended up working with kids who actually live a lifestyle of traveling. And it was just cool to see the first time that they, like even our models who ended up being my fixers, and the first time they put on the clothes, they were actually like, they're like unzipping things and kind of playing with things. And like, I think they were understanding the influence and the reference to why they were made in that way, which was cool to see. It's like taking, you know, it actually, it actually worked. It actually connected full circle.
And how long was the actual shoot?
The shoot was like three days, with about a month of prep, because just to like, you have to like, to make sure that the kids show up on the day, you literally have to go to their house, eat with them, meet their family, tell everyone they know what day they're supposed to be there, you know. And it got to a point where I was like a little mini celebrity in the town. Everyone was like waiting for this thing to happen, which also was amazing. I mean,
and Grace, this is, I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, the third time when you've gone back to the place or the context which has informed the making of the clothes and, you know, collaborated with a photographer or a filmmaker to make a set of visuals. The first was with Ebonics and I think Senegal. And for you, what is this gesture of returning and emplacing the clothes within the context which has inspired their making mean for you?
I think, I guess I tend to romanticize things, and I have a very idealized idea of beauty and representation, and the way I create collections is through having a very clear idea of a character and of a mood and of a world and environment in which they inhabit. And I'm aware that that is a fantasy, and it's woven together through fragments and sound and imagery. So to return to a place of inspiration is kind of a reality check in some ways to situate the work in some kind of context and see how people react to it. And that often then informs work later. So I kind of see it as part of the research process. But having the first shoot that I did with Harley Weir in Senegal, I think I'm really interested in how people relate to the clothing. And I also did a project with Harley in Udaipur and Delhi, and actually when we were there, the clothing felt so synchronized with the style that people just, it was like so natural. Like that people really understood the silhouettes. And
yeah.
So I find that quite interesting when there's a commonality and understanding around clothing. So yeah.
And Nick, I want to, you've been working in India, and have you looked at, there's a large lineage of, outside of photographers and people who've taken pictures in India. Were those reference points for you at all? I mean, someone who I think of is the American photographer William Gedney, who also shared, when he was there on his 2 extended trips to India, went in doing a lot of research and, try to inform himself of where he was going before he went there. And quite through his time there, one of his preoccupations, he was a street photographer, was to look at men and how they engage and interact with one another and the casual intimacies that you see on the street. And I mean, there is a very clear focus in the photographs to look at men and their collective engagement, but also how individually they move through space and in the public arena particularly. And representations of masculinity has been something that you and through your work have also interrogated through the prism of the Black experience. So I'd be curious to hear about that.
To be honest, I intentionally didn't look at too much photography coming out of the West, focused on India, just because I didn't want it to have that as part of my conscience when I went there. Because I was finding that the more I tried to either replicate something that had already been done at a certain time and place, kind of like speaking to what Grace was saying about pulling all these fragments together and building a kind of fantasy of what you expect a situation to be. It's, I don't know, for some reason in India that just doesn't work, because you start, like you leave your house, you start walking down the street in order to be like, this is what I'm gonna do. In 3 minutes, I'm gonna be doing this thing. And something happens along that time that like 8 hours later, you're like, oh shit, I didn't even do that thing. Like someone grabs you and it's like, oh, your tattoo, and they're like, I have the same tattoo, and they show me, and then they take you to their house, and it just kind of, I think the more, with India, I just try to be as open as possible, and I think it's more of the personal relationships that
the sustained engagement with them.
Yeah, and especially with the men, I think more and more they feel so comfortable also being around me and sharing, especially in certain areas. I mean, I've been with certain tribes that are matriarchal, and the women are the first ones to come and greet you, and that, those relationships that we see with the closeness of men actually don't exist in those. So it's very much like it's on a case-by-case basis, but when they are the first ones, they come and they kind of like examine you. We feel very comfortable being around you, but it just makes for, at least for me, for an easier way to share. And it's a little bit, you have to like break through that initial comfort zone of people coming up and like, I used to have different earrings, and actually the guy whose earring I photographed that's up in there in the corner was the one, he was like playing, he came up and he was playing with my earrings, like playing with my ears the first time I met him. And I was like, it was a weird experience at first, but it ended up him showing me his earrings and convincing me to go get the same ones, and now I have the same ones. And, so it's just, I think it's about like trying to just give and take and be open, kind of equally.
And beyond even the representation of men, I think there are some other interesting persistent visual motifs throughout the portfolio. I would say, an interest in vernacular signboardage or painted vernacular billboards, and some of those elements which you've incorporated into the installation over here. Color is another element that kind of recurs, and it's very present. There's a chromatic exuberance to even Grace's collection, and I was intrigued by how you achieved that kind of balance in terms of the color that has informed the clothes itself, but then also seeing it in situ in the most quotidian, casual way. Was that conscious, or did that just kind of happen?
I don't know that it's conscious, but like when we moved some of the racks in order to do the talk, but usually they're sitting this way, and then that rack is sitting that way. And when we were photographing the exhibition, all these, like, we ended up painting the wall as well based on like swatches that we had kind of like scrapped. But then seeing, for instance, like the colors against where they, the photographs of where they existed, I don't know, it just really, whether it's conscious or not, maybe it's subconscious more, and it...
And so when you were taking the pictures, it was you were just spending time together. They weren't staged setups in a way.
No, for the most part, no. Because I personally try not to approach it from too academic of a perspective, because there's actually, in the situations I'm in, there's almost no time to think. And that's, I think, speaking to when you said we work very differently. I think a lot of the analyzation or the analysis of my work is done pre and post actually making the work. And yeah, it's very visual. It's very much trying to capture some sort of a moment or sensory. It's not specifically visual, but whether it's musical or it's trying to somehow capture a taste or a feeling.
Yeah. The installation is very interesting as an extension of the portfolio of images, in that of course, it sets up a context in which to look at the clothes, and it gives people a broader canvas, but it also suggests your personal engagements and affinities to India, and in a way makes very transparent the way you'll have come to understand or appreciate the country or the specificity of Indian culture that you've both been preoccupied in looking at. Now, you live in London, you live in New York. How did this practically come together? Because there are many elements in this installation. And maybe could you pick out maybe one or two and describe some of the things from your own personal collections that are in this installation?
Yeah. So I guess a lot of our communication has been kind of through texting and emails and calls, and often the way we work together is you'll often share with me like a large amount of imagery, which and then we'll kind of go back and forth and respond to that. So we also work.
Sorry.
No, but
I apologize every time.
I love that kind of because I think I'm like really about editing things and being very specific, and then to have that kind of broadness has an amazing energy to it. So I think that's been really exciting for me. So a lot of it's through conversation, because I haven't been in New York. So also a friend of ours called Julia Wagner, who's a set designer who is based in New York, has worked really closely with Nick on this. And both Julia and Nick were also at my exhibition in London, and Nick was part of the exhibition at the Serpentine. So Julia was quite familiar with how I was thinking about creating these domestic spaces. So we're all just quite used to working with each other, and I think it was about sharing imagery and also sending. I think one of the intentions was having things from both of our collections that we've collected up from our time spent in India, but blurring the lines. People might assume that it's all Nick's kind of objects, and I think we were trying to just show the connections between the way we collect things as well. So actually one of the images on the wall, which is the smaller one with a guy holding the light.
Yes.
That was, I collected that when I was in Udaipur about 4 years ago, or 3 years ago, and I did, when I was doing a film with Harley actually, and we worked with a marching band, and we were working with them all day, and when we first came to meet them, they had this portfolio of all these images of their different uniforms, and so that was a really old one that they gave me. So that was something that I collected, and I was really interested in the clothing and the way that the image was composed.
Yeah, I mean, that's funny you say that it was an old one. I love like when you ask people to buy or to trade for things, they always want to give you the ones with the most character, which I think is something that we always want, and they want the new version. Anytime I get something, like if I get I want someone to Xerox something for me, they'll always Xerox it, keep the new one, and give me the original, which is such an amazing thing, because it kind of shows the value systems being, like, to them, the original is going to last longer in time. They'll be able to keep it around, where for us, the new one will. But yeah, I think what was interesting to me is looking at everything as kind of reference, and almost giving things a level playing field, because we both have collected so much that informed both of our practices. And like, I know I've looked at Grace's work for reference on maybe some of the ways that bodies are, or things in ways to photograph out there, and the way that clothing sits on people, or even like seeing how she understands the religious or spiritual or devotional practices of India, and like using that as inspiration to do something. And hopefully, I think it's vice versa. So it was cool seeing what would be in just my work alone, a finished product, a photograph printed and displayed, as this in-between where it's not necessarily finished. It's always in conversation with the rest of what came before it and what's going to come after it. And I think we both tried to choose objects that sat in that same space.
Okay.
Maybe that were something, or in the case of all these plates, most of those are made out of packaging material, some of them out of natural materials that were obviously created for a certain purpose, fully repurposed into something new, which was a plate. And then we tried to take it one step further and show them as sort of contemporary, not relics, but, art objects, and give them kind of the respect to the process of making them that they, or at least that I saw in them. So I think it really keeps the dialogue moving.
Yeah. And are you working on any other collaborations in the near future?
I guess so. It feels quite ongoing, the way things have just unraveled.
Yeah.
And so it feels just quite a natural evolution. Like, Nick was involved in the devotional sound evening that I did last night as well. So it feels it's quite natural to continue that.
Yeah. Why not?
Why not? So I think, do we have some more time? Or okay, great. So, because I wanted to continue this conversation about, making your subjective research interests so transparent to, people who engage with your practices, and what that, how does that kind of imagine? How do people kind of imagine the work? I mean, you've said in the past also that it's not prescriptive, but you feel a responsibility to share the way you arrive at the work you do. And I think that, in the current restive moment that we're in, when, and I've done a lot of research on this, historically looking at how outsiders have engaged with India through various mediums, and it's, that process is, subjectivized, and it pushes people into various different types of acts of creation. And I think what's so interesting about the work that you've done, and even the collaboration that you'll have, that has resulted out of the work, is, the desire, it seems, is to, as you're working through what manifests, it is understanding your own sensibilities. They kind of come together in an iterative manner, and what results is, as you said, you used the word hybrid, and it's the details of the clothes reference certain kinds of Indian garments, but then you use technical fabrics as well to kind of mitigate that. And, I find that very compelling, and situating the clothes within this broader context.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, it's almost like an archiving process, and I like to record my process. I'm really interested in archiving as a kind of form of creation, and actually I'm thinking about establishing a library and a very specific archiving process, but also someone like Paul Sapuya, who I've collaborated with in the past. He also does archiving for like some older artists when they haven't had set up systems of creation. I find that really interesting. So for me, I think it's having a record of the process and having transparency if people want to engage and go further into the point of inspiration. But I also think that for me, it's about what I'm bringing to the creative process is the way that I'm bringing things together and situating them in conversation with each other. It's kind of finding new forms between spaces is what I'm interested in.
And, as you said, there's the immediacy of your approach and the kind of restrained, research-based approach of your practice, and the way that has congealed into the portfolio of images. And it was interesting to see that it wasn't necessarily only images that surrounded the clothes, there was some of your other practice as well in there. And I was trying to think of, a kind of lineage for that kind of photography and in terms of an Indian context, because there has been, of course, a number of fashion editorials, very conventional fashion editorials that have taken place in India, but this kind of sidestepped that in a way and was working very much outside of that paradigm. It was closer to street photography, but not so because it was being authored by two of you. So again, it kind of, I mean, I'm curious to hear more about that from the two of you in terms of, there is a lineage of photography and fashion editorial starting from Norman Parkinson to what Vogue India does today, and how this sidesteps that and is how you place the collaboration in relation to that kind of imagery.
I think, in this instance, Nick was in Pushkar, so I wasn't there for the shoot. So I was, we were kind of texting a lot and communicating, and I guess I was kind of directing you in some ways to respond to the themes that I'd been talking about. I shared with you some of my research for the collection, and so it was kind of about editing and steering the work around that kind of point of reference. I guess that's kind of how it developed.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the whole conversation, when it started, I was already in India.
Yeah.
And so from the time we started talking about Grace's direction and her research, and most of which was actually new to me, because it just happened to be. It wasn't research that I had done, so it was actually super interesting to kind of be even subconsciously in that mindset and start focusing on and working in that direction. And I think the amazing thing is, like, all the images that were shown and shot and presented in that portfolio were all shot during our conversations leading up to the shoot, and even during the shoot. I mean, it was literally at a point where we were shooting the boys, and something would happen, and you would turn and shoot that, or a camel would walk by, so I think there's like no distinction between the situation, and the fact that in the same way the clothes work so well into the society, I think, like, why make any distinction and say this is our photo shoot that we did as an editorial and this is all outside when they're happening simultaneously?
Because there was also a lot of archival material or older photographs that you've taken that we also included as well.
Yeah, that we included as, originally we started speaking about as inspiration, but actually what ended up in the portfolio was mostly stuff that was just happening alongside, which is I think it's more transparent of a process. It's almost like doing research on the spot as you're making kind of the final product.
No, and I think that what that suggests, and what this suggests as well, this installation, is that we're constantly working through our own understanding of a context, a situation, a place, a culture, and nothing is kind of fixed in any manner. And, placing the work that you'll do within a dialogue with each other with very different kinds of approaches and aesthetic strategies as well, suggests that cross-cultural exchanges and conversations are one that are continuously happening. They're not fixed within a particular moment of engagement. And I think that's what really is very generous and graceful about this project. So, thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you.